Welcome to G News, the good news.
Yeah, right.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another G News podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about trade, specifically some recent trade agreements and the situation today. Joining me today is Labour's spokesperson for trade, for land information and regional development, Damien O'Connor. Hi, Damien, and welcome to the show.
How are you? It's great
I'm
to
really
be
well.
here.
Oh, I think it's good to have you. Damien, you've been Labour's MP for West Coast Tasman since 1993, and you've had all sorts of experience with many different portfolios. But today I just wanted to talk about trade and specifically some deals, some recent deals that you were involved with as New Zealand was coming out of COVID and the Ukraine war was underway. Starting with the New Zealand-EU Free Trade Agreement, which concluded its negotiations in June 2022. You were there with Dame Jacinda Ardern when she got that deal over the line. Could you give us some background about that deal, the negotiations, and getting it over the line?
Well, kia ora. Look, it's great to be here, and the EU one came on the back of the UK one, which had literally started in the middle of COVID. I had to get a permission to travel, as we all did, to go from my home into Nelson to have the first discussion with Liz Truss, actually, who was the Trade Minister at the time. And so it goes back, we worked through that. It was a very a rapidly negotiated trade agreement. Then, having concluded that one, we looked at the EU. We had some early discussions. There's a view that it's a complex 27 member states, very sophisticated. They haven't traditionally been enthusiastic about trade, and that us knocking on the door they've been working through with Australia, was going to be hard work. Nonetheless, we travelled, we did our very best to build the connections, give justification for a trade agreement with 5.5 million people, and we kept that going. Officials were amazing, and we kept that moving, came to close to a conclusion, and of course it was always going to be hard in things like beef and dairy, and we'd been in touch with the sectors saying, if you want unlimited access, it's probably not going to happen, but we'll negotiate as much as we can. In the end, we got about 8 times the volume in some of those areas for beef and for dairy, and it was literally down to the last negotiations to get an extra 1,000 tonnes of beef, which was the last meeting. So I was going, between my officials and Valdis Dombrovskis, who was the Trade Commissioner, and we finally agreed to sign off that agreement. The Australians, on the other hand, of course, decided not to, and are still, not seeing the benefits of some of those tariff reductions into the EU. We are. It's a great agreement, and at a time of uncertainty in global trade, the deal with the EU, like-minded partners, democratic states for the most part, upholding the values, trying to push forward on climate change, uphold standards around labour. It was a far-reaching agreement. Some people grumbled about it, but now they see it actually as leading edge and where the world has to move in terms of international connectedness and trade. And Jacinda had discussed the agreement and made a few phone calls through the period just to move it along, because Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the EU, she had to work with some of her member state leaders, of course, to encourage them and reassure them that this wasn't going to cripple the farmers in particular, who are always the most sensitive over there, but was going to offer real value. And indeed we did. And so we concluded that agreement. It then had to go through the process of checking the agreement, legal checking and the rest, and of course the incoming national government signed that off or ratified and brought it into place. But we're all, I think, enthusiastic about that process.
Yes. Well, after the EU negotiations and even today, Nationals' Todd McClay has been saying that we should have taken longer to get more access for New Zealand meat to the EU. And some farmers have said that there wasn't a commercially meaningful level of access for New Zealand beef to the EU. But we sure got a lot more access to much more than we had before that agreement. And isn't this always the case that nations where small farms are heavily subsidised and farmers have considerable political clout, isn't this always the case that you run up against these kind of difficulties?
Indeed, that is the reality, and because food is, essential part of life, and farmers are a key part of that production system, then it's the most sensitive part of trade agreements most parts of the world, even in the US where there's huge amounts of food produced, the farmers still have quite a bit of political clout and so don't want any competition that they think might undermine the value of their produce. So too for the Europeans, India in particular, our biggest dairy industry in the world, millions and millions of very small farmers, they don't want to see efficient dairy product from New Zealand coming into their market, and that will be one of the sticking points in the India agreement. So, but if you roll that back, it's always been a challenge for a country like ours, and I think we should be very proud of what we've got. If we can negotiate that upward, that's great. But actually, we have access for lots of volume into markets around the world. Exporters want the choices, but life's not perfect, and we'll try and negotiate those options for them. But ultimately, there are a lot of opportunities out there that are still not being taken up by exporters, and so we have a job to do to go around, and indeed with the EU trade agreement, to reassure, well, firstly to explain what is available and through these trade agreements, and then to encourage exporters to take it up. And for many, they've said, look, China's the highest returning market at the moment. We're not going to worry about the EU. Nice to have on the sideline, and sometimes that's frustrating having, committed so much effort to provide that access and then not have it taken up. But between the UK and the EU, lots of valuable, high returning market access for our exporters, and we should thank our negotiators, and I'm very proud to have been part of that process.
Yes. Well, you mentioned before the UK agreement. Labor also upgraded the China FTA, and you struck up an FTA with the UK. Can you tell us more about the UK free trade agreement and what negotiations and background to that was all about?
Well, again, post-Brexit, we realised that, such a valuable market, something that we had, of course, entirely relied upon and then stepped away from in the 70s when the UK joined the EU. We thought we had no formal arrangements with a high-value market, one that understood New Zealand, understood our products, but we weren't quite sure where we'd be with legal access and protections for our exporters. So we had to move on that fairly quickly, and the UK was reaching out for trade agreements. As I say, they were kind of on their own post-Brexit. New Zealand and Australia were a good place to start, and so literally it was in the middle of COVID. Liz Truss was the trade minister. She was a pro-Brexiter, so she had a great incentive to get these trade agreements underway and move forward. But it was interesting, the first meeting, for example, taking up the issue of animal welfare, something that we haven't had in our trade agreements. She said, well, we've got to have a chapter on animal welfare. And so I said, that's okay. We have high standards of animal welfare, but we run different farm systems. So I had to explain and push back a bit, saying, well, you can't impose your standards on us and we won't impose them on you. We should commit to uphold and progress the best animal welfare standards we can in the different systems that we run. And that's kind of, that was the process of negotiation. For the UK, it was new. They hadn't negotiated trade agreements. They hadn't had to. And so I think because of our high quality, outstanding professionals, negotiators, they were able to teach the UK how to work through this process. And indeed, we concluded again with a brilliant agreement where there are virtually no barriers at all to trade into that market, and we're starting to see some real growth, which is wonderful. Brad Burgess was our High Commissioner or our ambassador in Ireland at the time, and he negotiated online a lot of it, visited occasionally, but he has to be applauded and thanked for his leading role, backed up by a whole lot of people, of course, who were working via Zoom to negotiate an agreement, something that people would never have thought possible probably 10 years ago.
Wow, that's great. We're hearing a lot of self-praise from the National Party about how it's done the fastest ever trade agreement negotiation with the UAE. But the origins of that deal go way back to 2007 when Labor were progressing the China FTA and another one with the Gulf Cooperation Council. And the truth here is that the UAE sent a minister to New Zealand in May 2023 who was seeking a resumption of free trade agreement negotiations, and you confirmed that with her, and you went over and visited the UAE with a delegation in September 23 before the election. Could you tell us a bit about that visit, what that was about, and what the deal was about, and whether Todd McClay is really just stealing a bit of credit here?
Well, I think it's the nature of politics that credit will be stolen wherever it can be, and the timing of these agreements is obviously critical. When Phil Goff, going back to 2007, 2008, he'd been negotiating with China and concluded that an amazing agreement, which saved our country through the global financial crisis. But there'd also been work with the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and they've been making good progress. But actually, in 2009, after we'd left government, and no fault of the incoming government, but that effectively got stalled in 2009, and one of the members of the GCC decided that they didn't want to move forward on those. And so that had been parked for quite some time. 7 member states, a big population of very wealthy countries, moved that forward. And of course, the UAE had been reaching out on its own to make progress with trade agreements. And I'd met with the minister on numerous occasions, built a good relationship. And then, as I say, one visited our country saying, look, we really want to move forward formally. There was a view within New Zealand that we wanted to progress the multilateral agreement with the GCC, not one by one with the member states. And there's some logic to that, certainly access to a bigger market. And we didn't want to offend other members of the GCC if we were to then push forward. It was my view that we should continue negotiations with the UAE and with the GCC in parallel. That is indeed what occurred. And so when the UAE came here, I had talks with my colleagues, with officials, and we said, let's commit to move forward on the UAE one, and because indications were the GCC weren't going to be offended, and indeed that is what happened. And the UAE it was a rapid agreement with a very open state. They want to be the hub for trading through the Middle East. And are making great progress, and we've got direct flights, and there's a whole lot of reasons that's a good agreement. At the same time, the GCC agreement was moving. I think there'd been 5 rounds of negotiations with us, and then there were another 2 rounds that concluded that agreement as well. So, yes, Todd McClay and National have claimed the rights for those 2 agreements. We had some good input into that process. We're very happy and proud, and as happens, trade's not a partisan issue for New Zealand. We're entirely dependent upon it. We do what we can when we can. I was a little annoyed at some of the discrediting, I guess, of the efforts through our time in government. But look, that's politics.
Well, speaking of Todd McClay, we keep hearing he visited India for 5 times in 2024. And after the pretty harsh criticisms that he made about waiting longer to get a better deal for meat with the EU, the boasting's already begun about how fast we will negotiate with India, and we hear dairy and beef products won't really necessarily be on the table there. So this sounds like hypocrisy from Todd McLean to me. But what are your thoughts on doing an FTA with India and how Modi may have been anticipating Trump's tariffs? And he got FTAs going and talks with the UK and the EU alongside FTA talks that were being resumed with New Zealand at the same time.
Look, I mean, you raised very interesting points. India's it's a complex, massive country with huge opportunity. I had been involved as Associate Trade Minister in RCEP. Again, a valuable agreement. Doesn't provide the kind of access that everyone wants, but tying up about a third of the world's trade. India pulled out at the last minute from RCEP, and so there's always been a view that they will remain independent, no matter how hard we try. Roll that forward. Everyone's looking to India. It's growing, 1.4 billion people, huge opportunities. But the reality of dairy is something that will always be a sticking point for us. We support the government making progress there. I visited 3 times, built a good relationship, but was really I guess, discouraged from using the word FTA, was encouraged to use the word partnerships and kind of agreements that between commercial companies that would move us forward. And indeed, that's what we did. And the governments continue with that. What kind of agreement falls out of this process, we'll wait and see. But one that doesn't include, our major exports, will hardly be comprehensive. Now, the government's assured us that it will be comprehensive trade agreement. Let's wait and see, and we wish them luck for that. But I think we have to be a bit more honest. What really did annoy, I think, Chris Hipkins, myself, Jacinda Ardern, the work that we've done to build relationships with India, with Prime Minister Modi, were substantive. As I say, even David Parker had been there, Winston Peters had been there, and of course we had COVID in the middle of that, so we weren't able to travel as much as we liked. Nonetheless, we were building relationships upon which this trade agreement will hopefully be signed, and to say that they were starting from scratch was rather insulting, and it's a shame, because in most other areas of trade we've always acknowledged one another's efforts. We are moving into a new world of politics, of partisan and populist ranting, I think, in some cases, and we've got to step back from that and work together as a country. We're a very, very small nation, and if we start kind of dividing ourselves up and scrapping among ourselves, we'll be irrelevant when it comes to the world of international trade.
Well, speaking of this new world, since Trump's Liberation Day on the 2nd of April, we've seen growth forecasts being downgraded, and we've seen Trump walk back his tariffs for everyone but China, and those that he'd previously made against Canada and Mexico. China are saying that there are no talks in progress at the moment with the USA, while Trump is saying that there is. And China says, well, if you want talks, cancel all of these reciprocal tariffs. Meanwhile, we've got Winston fighting with Luxon, and Luxon doing a big photo op tour overseas at the moment. So what do you think could be the real impacts on New Zealand trade from all of this uncertainty?
I guess chaos is the word that best describes what's occurring around the world. We're lucky, and some people think, there's a demand for protein, we'll be okay, because cattle numbers in the US are down, in Australia. And look, I wouldn't take any comfort from anything that is occurring. We're not quite sure what Trump will implement ultimately. It's kind of one step forward, 2 steps back, 2 forward. And so when countries like China and the US can't agree on what is the situation, then the rest of us, have to be totally confused as well. So it might provide some short-term market opportunities, but if you have the US economy go into some kind of recession, if China continues to move along at a lower pace of economic growth, then those are the key markets, our 2 biggest export markets. Then that's going to affect demand. There will always be opportunities for individual exporters, but overall, it may be harder for our country to grow the trade goods and services that we need to actually, to prosper. So nothing good coming from this. The rules of trade, the World Trade Organization, they'll be wondering what to do as well, because through the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, GATT, as it was early on, and the progress that we made, and some people say it just protects the big countries. This is about opportunities for small developing countries to get fair access into some big markets. And there's talk of Mercosur, although Mercosur as a bloc is quite a big trade bloc into the EU. There are still issues to work through there. Should we work with Mercosur? Should CPTPP be the basis for a growing trade agreement? And we had heard from people in the EU, they thought that a good idea. David Parker had suggested it. Todd McClay's referred to it, and Christopher Luxon's now using it. Look, whatever the construct, RCEP being another possible one, that we can build some rules with like-minded countries who see the value in reassurances and some legal protection for people who might export, products, expect to get paid, and then without any kind of legal frameworks, simply have no return for that. We've heard of many of those situations over the years, so we have to have trade agreements that give protection for both the importers and the exporters. That's the only way we can make, as I say, have reliable interdependence upon one another, and that's the world we live in. If we think we can shut ourselves off and be independent and not rely on others, then we're dreaming.
Good points. On the April the 2nd, the New Zealand dollar was sitting around 58 cents against the greenback, and then it fell to about 55 cents, which some say provided a shock absorber for New Zealand exporters to the United States. But then with Trump's suspension of the reciprocal tariffs, the New Zealand dollar has shot back up to about 60 cents against the greenback now. Now, this is likely to be hurting our exporters to the United States. What do you see the New Zealand government doing to help, and what do you think they should be doing in your view?
And look, it's a very hard one because we've allowed our dollar to float. Our dollar's been traded by people who wheel and deal and make money off the movement of that dollar at our expense often. I mean, the lowering of the dollar does give exporters a better return, but also increase the cost of their inputs. And I see, just recently the cost of urea is like to go up. It's a key input for many farmers. Again, probably the lower dollar overall is better for us, and it might discourage unnecessary imports, but it does affect our economy. The government needs to move forward. It talks about infrastructure. It stepped back from much of that investment. We had tried to put money into that area, offer security around trades training and skilled people. That again is in a period of uncertainty. So the government's done a lot of talking, but on the ground, we've yet to see some real money. Announcements around roading projects are well and good, but actually you need to know that there's work going on now, and we have the skills and money available. And so, the austerity that the government has implemented on the country to pay for tax cuts, in my view and our view, has been stupid at a time when we needed to see some confidence in terms of that investment and the companies themselves supporting their investments in technology, their investments in their people, so that we can build our economy overall. And so I guess in summary, the uncertainty caused here domestically by the government is not helping us get through a really quite a challenging and troubling time in international trade. So the dollar will go up and down. Exporters might see, opportunity, the global dairy trade, which goes up and down. People watch it closely. Overall, it's, dairy is looking okay, but something could disrupt that, and that would have a huge impact on our economy. So we have to be cautious. And if you're in business as a farmer or some other area of our economy, you should be kind of looking out for the rainy days that come more often than they used to, and the government should be giving some certainty in terms of that infrastructural investment as a core part of our economic development.
You mentioned before the different kinds of ways in which people around the world are investigating ways in which to carry on in a stable trade environment despite a Trump administration turning their heads on the rules-based order when it comes to trade. I think you gave examples of the EU and the CPTPP. What's your take on exploring those kind of avenues and how we do that without getting offside with the United States?
It's very hard to know what to do that doesn't offend the US at the moment. I guess continuing to work on and build those commercial arrangements between companies, it should put us in a good position. I think politically there's a lot of changes are going to occur, but I think there's a growing realization in the US that from a commercial perspective, this is not helping them, and there's some pushback on what Trump is doing. So we just have to be the reliable, trusted and partner in all areas, as I say, of diplomatic relations, of commercial expertise and reliable supply. That's where we need to go. In terms of the other agreements, we just have to keep talking. And MFAT will say we've got limited resources. I mean, I certainly pushed as Trade Minister, and no doubt Tom McClay and others will, to extend our efforts to make sure we don't shut the door with anyone. And we'd been talking with, on occasions, some of the Central American countries. And that's another area of possibility. Instability in those countries meant that we couldn't make much trade progress there as we would have liked, the Pacific Alliance. But I'm sure the government will go back and look to that. Whether the Mercosur trade bloc is a good one for us to be dealing with, hard to know at this stage. We have to look carefully at what that would mean. But we've just got to knock on every door and make sure that we are flexible enough, but maintain our standards and our values. And I think trading away some of our defence policy, as Judith Collins had indicated, is not smart. Staying out of the Global Shipping Alliance, something that has taken 10 years to negotiate. Government, I don't know why, have said that we're going to stay out of that. It's just lunacy in my view. Yes, we are at the bottom of the world. Yes, we do rely on shipping, and it may affect us more than others. But if we're not part of that, the ships simply won't come here. So why they're stalling on that, I have no idea. But they better get on with it and say that for the rest of the world to come up with a lower carbon shipping objective, it's not, the details are still to be worked through, but if we don't agree to that objective as well, as I say, it's lunacy.
I couldn't agree more. As far as free trade agreements go, it's my opinion that the Labor government will protect us from selling off vast public infrastructure to outside nations and forces. And also, Labor always inserts the Treaty of Waitangi clauses into all of our FTAs. Can you comment on this government's moves to allow greater access to sell off our public infrastructure, or to weaken anything around treaty protections?
There's a lot of noise in that area. There's a basic question that each of us should ask ourselves: does ownership matter? And people say, what do you mean? Well, think of anything that you own, any bit of property that you have, or, extend that out to ownership of the local dairy or business, or of local council assets, or indeed of the nation's infrastructure. That's a question that should be asked. Does it matter over time? And how does it shift the influence on a direction of travel? And so putting that question to one side, this government does seem to be really keen on bringing in people with lots of money and bringing lots of investment. and thinking that that will solve all our economic woes. Look, we have relied traditionally on overseas investment because we didn't have a lot of capital of our own. That's not the situation now. We have large investment funds. We can invest more in ourselves, and I think we're starting to see some of that happening, which is great. But if we just open the door to a flood of foreign investment, we won't be able to control our destiny, and we will be held to ransom by, monopoly investors who take charge of some of the core assets that we have, airports, ports, things like that. We can be squeezed. Even our banks, the four major banks owned by the Australians, there's an inquiry going on. Most people are saying that we're getting squeezed. Excess profits are being taken. I believe that. But we don't have any ability to do that because the shareholders of those banks who make the calls, they're sitting in Australia, not here. So then if you roll that forward to, the possibility of more foreign investment, that does mean that there's less influence from New Zealand as to the direction of travel in the country that we want for the future. You don't get something for nothing. And there are people who just want to clip the ticket in the movement of that investment, the money coming in. They get a small percentage of that if they can find a good investment prospect. And often though the people with the power and the influence and the connections with the National Act Party, and we're just going to make sure that their opinion doesn't override the long-term interest of New Zealanders. And so we in Labour always look for that long-term outcome for Māori, for the Treaty of Waitangi. Our core partnership with Māori is very, very important. Their growing influence in the economy, they have a right to have some say as to the direction of travel as well. So all quite complex issues. We are learning as we go, just allowing, a big influx of foreign investment, might upset that balance and indeed put us in a situation that we don't want in 10 years' time. We've got to look forward. It's not simply about short-term opportunities.
Thank you for that answer. That's really great. Finally, the Paris Agreement and our climate commitments, and in particular with regard to the European Union Free Trade Agreement, if New Zealand walks back on its nationally determined contributions, like it sounds probable under this government, what could be the effects on our trade with the European Union?
Well, firstly, it affects our international credibility. The fact that we signed up to it, was a national government that signed up to it, excuse me, as our part in international efforts to reduce global warming. And some of the reports we're getting are quite alarming. We seem to be off target. Does that mean we should give up? No, not at all. Does it mean that it shouldn't be part of trade agreements? No, not at all. I think the fact that the EU and New Zealand committed to do our best to commit to that target, and whatever way possible, we would reduce our emissions, I think is what we should be doing. And, the government said, we could step back, or coalition partners said we could step back from Paris. We've had an assurance from Prime Minister Chris Luxon that, we'll commit to Paris, but, both New Zealand First and ACT are saying, why should we do that? We've got farming leaders saying we don't need to, we just need to make sure that we have no further effect on global warming, ignoring the reality that what we've done over the past 100 years has contributed to that global warming. So there's a moral responsibility for us in all areas of our economy to reduce our emissions where we can. And indeed, we can do that if people commit to it. It's not going to cost them profits or indeed sometimes not production, but working harder and doing more and just thinking we'll be better off is again lunacy, when in fact we've got to look at what we do it better and get better returns for what we do. And so in all areas of our economy, we simply need to be more efficient with the use of our hydrocarbons, use less energy where we can, and that for the most part will mean better profits and better returns. But this government has given confused signals to many across the economy. They're not quite sure what they will do. There are people saying, will we burn coal now for our electricity? Yes, we do. Should we burn less? Yes, we should if we can. They've made noises about renewables, and that's great, but let's show us, how you'll do that. And, we had projects like Onslow, which is a battery effectively for winter electricity production. That's been shelved when indeed I think it should have been, we should do more research on that project. It may not be the answer, but just simply saying that these things are not on, and then saying that they'll do more around renewable without providing clear direction or clear planning or a strategy is going to leave us in a muddle. And I think the fear of Labor politicians is that it's going to be quite a mess for us to clean up when eventually voters in New Zealand realise that they need clearer direction, a clearer vision, and a better government.
Right on. Thanks so much, Damien. Thanks for coming and talking to us today. I think your comments have been very nuanced and knowledgeable and very valuable for our listeners. So I'd love to have you back again, and hopefully you have a really good Saturday, and we'll see you again soon.
Look, thanks very much. And I just want to acknowledge, the efforts that you make to promote discussion and debate on these things. These are really critical issues. Too often we're seeing through social media short-term opinions rather than long-term thinking. And so well done. A pleasure to have an opinion and hopefully provoke some thinking.
Thanks very much, Damien. We'll see you later.
Welcome to G News, the good news.